Life in a Late Woodland Native American Village in Michigan, Part 1 by Dennis M. Morrison. And before I begin this, I want to say that I have noticed a little bit of animosity in some people that I'm making videos that pertain to the Native American prehistory here in Michigan. I don't really understand that. I'm not someone who has just come on the scene lately and decided to put together these videos. I began studying the Native American people in northeast Michigan back in 1985, and so it's not something that I've just begun. I've had a lot of material published in various magazines about the finds that I've made, including the Michigan Archaeologist. And so this is not just something that I recently just decided to do. In a lot of the videos, I am doing nothing more than sharing experiences that I've had over the years with Native American people and with the relics that I've found. And I hope that you'll enjoy them. And I also hope that they may at some point serve some educational or historic value pertaining to the prehistory of northeast Michigan. Anyways, having said that, let me continue with part 1 of Life in a Late Woodland Native American Village in Michigan. Of the many different periods of Native American prehistory in Michigan, the Late Woodland is my favorite. Perhaps this is because so much work I have done out in the field has most often brought me in touch with this particular era. So in presenting this, I will use a lot of personal experience in my assessment of the daily life of those people. I have worked privately on a number of Native American Indian village sites over the years. The artifacts left behind are indeed fascinating and do tell us a lot about the late woodland lifestyles. But to gain a concept of their everyday life takes a lot of digging, but not in the ground, in old documents made when the first Europeans arrived on the scene. What was the individual like? What did they wear? What did they do for employment? How were they entertained? It is questions such as these that I will strive to answer in this series of videos. I think you might be surprised at how alike us, in some ways, these ancient peoples were. The late woodland period in Michigan dates from about 1400 years ago to 500 years ago, when contact with the first Europeans destroyed the neighborhood, so to speak. The daily routine, like our own, probably became somewhat monotonous. There was more variety in life, though, because through the course of a year, one person wore many different hats. The duties between the sexes were clearly defined, and a woman did not feel less important because she had her occupations to adhere to. Family life was very, very important also. The family was the basis of village strength. The late woodland village society held dear some common sense principles which we used to hold dear to. First, as stated, male and female had their roles, and these were not questioned, and in this they found strength. We too held this concept until the late 1960s. We had our defined roles, and it worked out until the feminist movement came to power, destroying those boundaries, and in the process ruining the family unit and the morality of our society. In late woodland culture, the male role was really no more important than the female role. The roles went hand in hand to make a whole. The family unit was preserved. They never faced the moral decay which has eaten away at our society like a cancer, because both male and female performed their duties, and in that there was harmony. What were the roles? Well, the male was the hunter, providing the meat for the village that the people need to consume, and this took up much of his time and included not only hunting but fishing. And by far I have found more stone net weights than arrows or spears. The male was also the protector of the village, always watchful for any danger which might threaten. The woman's role was no less important, and she was respected. And her role actually encompassed many more jobs of daily life than did the man's. The late woodland villagers often practiced some form of agriculture. The woman was given the very important position of being in charge of the gardens. She cleared ground, planted and harvested, She converted the produce into usable provisions for daily consumption as well as storing supplies for use in leaner seasons. The village was her domain. She would be the one to obtain firewood, gather water, make baskets, bark containers, and pottery vessels. Each of these occupations included many labor-intensive steps, and we'll look at them in more detail in future installments of this series. Yes, the woman had much to occupy her time. For the male, the safety of his village and his family weighed on his shoulders, which is why in part he had to be unencumbered with the domestic occupations. He had to always be ready to lay down his life on a moment's notice. Now let's move on to how the late woodland people dressed. We have a good idea here thanks to early accounts written by the Europeans when they arrived. Upon their coming to these shores, the late woodland ended. They of course used what was at hand, and they were experts at doing that. Styles, so to speak, were pretty uniform, but there was some room for individual expression. Clothing was made from skins of many animals, but deer was the main supplier of the raw goods. When a deer was taken for meat, its skin was used for clothing, and even the bones were used to fashion such goods as awls, needles, and even fishing hooks. Deer was largely used due to its size, and the skin became pliable. Sinew was used for stitching. With the preparation of the sinew for sewing, another important occupation was derived at. Robes were also made from beaver, bear, and other furs. So we can also deduce from this that tanning was another very important occupation, so the raw skins could be made ready for use. Designs were known to have been added to their clothing by the use of porcupine quills, shells, paint, and other items that would add a pleasing touch. The woodland Indians seemed to enjoy pretty things, just as we do today. But the men of the village dressed pretty much alike. In warm weather, the common fare was a simple breechcloth, which sometimes may have had painted or quilled designs added. Sometimes leggings were also worn. Skin moccasins protected the feet, and these had soft soles and a drooping flap. Pendants, called gorgets, were also worn by the men. I have found the remains of broken slate gorgets many times. Gorgets were most commonly shale, but shell ones have also been found. Seashell gorgets in Michigan clearly shows that our woodland dwellers either visited the oceans or traded with people who did. At the old Manhattan Creek site in Oscoda, Michigan, I found the remains of Iroquois pottery from the East Coast. So for more on that find, see my video Captive Heart. But it just goes to show there were known trade routes, and there's no doubt about that. More individuality was obtained by using feathers worn in various manners as well as body painting. Red ochre, graphite, plant and berry juice, charcoal, and soot were used as body paint when mixed with grease. Again, at my old Manhattan Creek site, I made a very unusual find which I termed to be a late woodland makeup kit. The find was published in Indian Artifact magazine some years ago. The kit consisted of a small stone mortar, very similar to a nutting stone, but much smaller, with a shallow depression in the center of it. With this was found a nicely defined finger pestle about 2.5 inches long and circular on the base. The circular end was discolored from the materials that had been ground with it. There was also a nice lump of red ochre and graphite. But best of all was the most beautiful stone knife that I have ever seen. It was over 5 inches long and flawless, and made from Bayport tabular chert. Beads were of great importance, and their use probably gave more individuality than any other aspect of Native American attire. Beads were crafted from many materials, which included fresh and saltwater shell, bone, copper, fossils, stone teeth, ivory, claws, and lots more. In his book, Primitive Man in Michigan, W.B. Hinsdale wrote, "Many beads are found in abundance in graves. These are so placed that we think that they may have been upon strings and were buried with the decorations of the body. Beautiful freshwater pearls have been exhumed. Beads were worn as necklaces, belts, and arm and leg bands. They were also used as hair and head ornaments." End quote. Winter clothing was well suited to the harsh Michigan weather. The people were well acclimated to the weather, which helped some. On the Lewis and Clark expedition across the continent in 1804, they told of seeing naked children playing on the ice beside a snowbound village with little or no notice of the cold at all. The French explorer Charlevoix told that the Potawatomi of southern Michigan wore highly decorated buffalo robes in the wintertime. While I'm not certain about the use of buffalo in Michigan, it is well known that robes of deer fur and bear were worn in the wintertime. Also, deerskin leggings were used. There is a lot to know about the Late Woodland Indians of Michigan, and this is just really a very brief look at, in the beginning of this series, of what their defined roles were and the type of clothing that they wore. And so hope you've enjoyed this very brief look, and in the next installment, which is a little bit longer, we'll be looking at the production of pottery, which was so important to the survival and the sedentary lifestyle of the Native American in the late woodland period. Thanks for taking a look. Welcome to part 2 of Life in a Late Woodland Native American Village in Michigan by Dennis M. Morrison. In part 2, we will look further at the late woodland culture as it existed in prehistoric Michigan. Back in 1987, or 85, 86, 87, when I first began working on the Native American history in Oscoda, Michigan, I immediately became obsessed with their pottery traditions, as there was so much of it just lying around. Housed in the collections of the Oscoda Sable Historical Society are the remains of over 1,500 vessels based on rim shards that came from one small site, the old Benetton Creek site. At least I believe they are still housed there. Pottery production was important to the lives of these people and encompassed a variety of occupations. Oftentimes, when looking at a piece of prehistoric pottery, a shard, the story of how it came to be in the first place does not come readily to mind, but there's a lot behind it. The process begins, of course, with finding an outcropping where raw clay can be obtained. This would take some advanced scout work, but once a source was located, it was revisited for a very, very long time. Once located, the clay had to be dug out, likely using a makeshift shovel made of wood or perhaps bone. The material would have to be placed in maybe baskets or some skin parcels to be taken back to the village for the next step in the production of the pots. The clay may have been carried following a trail or loaded into a dugout canoe to be transported. So making pottery also depended on carpentry for the making of the dugout canoe. We'll look at woodworking in a future video because woodworking was another very important aspect of late woodland life. Back at the village, the clay would have been stored for use, or if vessels were needed right away, production would begin. Either skin or woven mats were laid out and production could then start. There would be a number of items set out that would be used. A container of crushed rock or shell would be close by, which would be used for tempering. And I'll explain tempering in a moment, but the gathering of stone and shell and crushing it was another job that the Native American woman had to do. Tempering was added to the clay, mixed in, and acted as a binding agent which held the clay together and prevented the pot from exploding during the firing or baking process. Also on the mats would be a variety of smooth stones about palm size that would be used as trowels for smoothing the pot, primarily on the inside, as the outside was generally rough textured. There would be wooden paddles wrapped with woven cord, which was another occupation, weaving. The paddle was used over the surface of the unbaked pot, breaking up bare pockets again, keeping the pot from bursting when it was baked. The cord impressions on the pottery show a wide variety of weaving styles, something that would otherwise be unknown because the cordage did not withstand the ravages of time as their impressions did on the pottery shards. There would be a bowl of water and various odds and ends that could be impressed in the clay to make designs. There might be notched bones and sticks or feathers. Sometimes nothing more than the potter's fingernail was used to decorate the vessel. Almost always the decorative designs were on the upper rim and occasionally on the shoulder of the pot. Frequently, the inside of the pot rim was also decorated. Pottery between late and middle woodland differs not only in basic style, but also in how the pot was built. In the middle woodland, the pot was built up by coiling the clay into ropes or snakes. We've all done it as a child playing with Play-Doh. Usually when you find pottery shards, you can tell the age or at least the era it came from by how the pot broke. Middle woodland pots usually broke straight along the coil. These are called coil breaks. This is, however, not the only way you can date the pot. Now, late woodland pots were made mainly by the slab method. A slab of clay was flattened out and then built up. Before that began, the raw clay was beaten and crumbled to remove any bits of roots and debris that might weaken the pot again in the firing process. The tempering was then added after the clay was broken up and cleaned and mixed thoroughly and along with small amounts of water to make the clay pliable, workable. Once this is done, the pot can be built and decorations added. Pots ranged from simple bowls to very ornate vessels with highly decorated rims displaying castellation and flaring outwards. In decorating designs were pressed into the wet clay. It is not supposed that any particular meaning was conveyed by the designs, but that's something we really don't know for sure. The final step was in firing the pot or other clay items that were made. Kilns were not used in the late woodland, and the temperatures that they were able to achieve did not make an extremely durable vessel, and they were very porous. Slips were not used in Michigan pottery as they were in other parts of the country. The pots were carefully stacked, sticks and branches piled over them, and then set on fire with leaves over that so that the fire would smolder a long time. Clay was used for the production of other items as well, such as pipes for smoking. At Olvinet Creek, many shards from smoking pipes were found. These show another occupation, growing tobacco and preparing it to be smoked. Some clay pipes were simple tubes and others were elbow pipes. A number of the pipe shards I found showed a lot about how they were actually made because I found several bowls and stems which were broken in half, like they had actually been severed in half. And these showed that the pipes were formed around a carved wooden form that was left in place and burned away during the firing process. On one bowl that I found, you could see where the wooden form had actually been carved. You could see the stone knife marks in it. And at the end, where the stem would join the bowl, so that you could draw the smoke through it, you could see where a stick had been placed and again left in place and burned away during the firing process. It is known from accounts written by early European visitors that smoking was very popular with the Michigan late woodland people. Judging from the number of pipe shards found, this was certainly true at Olvinet Creek in Oscoda, Michigan. So in the production of pottery, we can see a number of other occupations that the late woodland people undertook. Woodworking came into play, as well as weaving cordage, making of baskets, and agriculture. The late woodland people were anything but lazy, to be sure. The pottery making tradition was passed generation from generation from woman to woman. It's starting when a girl was quite young. She would watch her mother, aunts, grandmother around the mat making the pottery, and in fact we have found at Old Venetton Creek the remains of little tiny pots that were obviously made by children because they were of such a crude nature. They were made by a girl learning that craft so that it could be carried on, through more coming generations. And in that way, this talent was passed from one to another. And just the boys also learned in the same way the production of arrowheads and stone tools, as we have found the remains of, again, very crude pieces that were obviously works of children. We also found bowls that were small, that were very very nicely made, that were perhaps child's vessels or seed vessels, as they're called. But the pottery that came from the late woodland period, there were many, many different sizes for many different needs, and all of it showed a high degree of talent in forming the pieces and decorating the pieces. And having looked at, as I said, we found the remains of over 1,500 pots just at that Old Venetton Creek site, but having looked at the remains of well over several thousand pottery shards, rim shards, it boggles the mind when you realize that absolutely no two were exactly alike. So pottery was important to these people because pottery also allowed a settled lifestyle, because in times past they didn't have the ability to process foods and store foods the way they did with pottery. Pottery gave them the ability to store foods for a long period of time. And certainly late woodland isn't the first era to have pottery. Early woodland was the first era in Michigan to have a pottery making tradition. But it reached its apex in the late woodland, and it would be interesting to see what it would have evolved into had the Europeans not come in and totally messed up the Native American culture, because the Native Americans then took over the use of metal cooking utensils and such, and the tradition of pottery making went by the wayside. Thank you for taking a listen. Next time we'll look at another aspect of late woodland life in the Michigan Native American villages. Thank you. Life in a Late Woodland Native American Village in Michigan, Part 3. So far in this series, we have looked at how people of the Late Woodland in Michigan dressed, how they made pottery, and a brief look at other occupations which I'll expand on in future installments. This time, though, I want to look at their woodworking skills. Back in 1990, the magazine Popular Woodworking carried an article of mine titled Working Wood in the Age of Stone. I will use that as the basis for this video, and we'll read the article in its entirety more towards the end of this. The late woodland period in Michigan dates from 500 to 1400 years ago, and a great deal of woodworking was done by these Native Americans, but few examples remain because, of course, the wood has long since rotted away. Though the coming of the Europeans ruined the Native American culture for selfish European causes, we can thank them for one thing. They left a written legacy of what life was like here in the Great Lakes region, and without that we would have little knowledge of the occupations and pursuits of these wonderful people. Besides the written record, we can also learn a great deal by the stone tools they made. On woodland sites, axes, both grooved and ungrooved, are common. Also found are chisels, gouges, flint blades, scrapers, stone spoke shaves, and the adze, as well as an abundance of stone drills. Wood was employed in the building of their lodges, fences, platforms, palisades. It was used for making bows, spears, and arrow shafts, as well as dugout canoes, and was the raw material for basket making. Wood was used for masks, totems, effigies, and bowls, plus likely hundreds of other uses that we don't even know at this point. There were also war clubs, cradle boards for babies. Let's begin with the dugout canoe. They were the common mode of transportation and were used more than the much romanticized white birch bark canoe. Actually, several partial examples of the dugouts have been found near Cedar Lake by Oscoda, Michigan. That they survived at all is because they had become encased in muck which sealed off the bacteria, causing decay, at least in part. One of the dearest friends I ever had was Jerry Wagner, who had a great talent for and love for recreating wooden relics using the same tools and methods the Native Americans used. I was at his private museum off F-41 as he showed me a dugout canoe that he had made and explained the process to me. Jerry had felled the tree, cedar I believe, using a stone axe as the Indians would do. As they would do, he burned into the standing tree and then chopped away the burnt wood, continuing this process over and over until the tree came down. The process alone took a great deal of patience and time. And remember, even starting the fire was a job that probably none of us watching this video could do without a pocket lighter or a pack of matches. Once the tree was down, fire was used again, burning into the log and chipping away the burned wood to form the hollow, with finishing work done with an adze, again stone and again on a wooden handle. Jerry, as I recall, said it took maybe 40 to 45 hours to complete, which was really a good investment for the Native American traveler. With care, he would have transport that might last 20 plus years. Compare that to the worker today. How long do we struggle at work for a vehicle that might never be paid for, traded off as it starts to fall apart, a money pit of repairs, gas, and insurance? Yes, in some ways, the late woodland dwellers were much smarter than we are today, plus the dugout canoe did not pollute the environment. The birch bark canoe that most of us think of in connection with the Native Americans was also a product of the ancient woodworker. A lightweight and durable conveyance indeed, though unlike the dugout, was susceptible to puncture. W.B. Hinsdale pointed out in his book, The First People of Michigan, that the production of the birch bark canoes was limited to the territory where the white birch tree grows sufficient in size for the purpose. He also pointed out that the bark of a few other trees was used for the purpose also. According to him, bark from some hickories made excellent canoes. Also, elm was said to be used at times. I'd like to quote the following from Mr. Hinsdale's book. The graceful specimens, so shapely and trim one sees now, are only a resemblance of the prototype made with stone tools and whatever other carpenter's implements the maker had devised. A knife and draw shave made of flint, a clamshell for finishing tools, a stone hatchet and a few perforators made of bone and antler, which were used as gimlets, could not have enabled the workman to produce more than a clumsy but nonetheless usable conveyance. Never mind the appearance, it is the invention and not the detail that testifies to the ingenuity of primitive man. Hinsdale used the word primitive, not me, for I in no wise view these woodland people as any more primitive than we are today. There is another device used in the navigation of the waters that also was produced by the woodland worker, and that, of course, was the paddle. Without this, they would have been, well, up the creek without a, well, you get the picture. Of the dugout, it was not enough to know how to craft the wood, but also how to care for the finished product over the years. When not in use, these crafts would season, and they'd dry out, crack, and shrink. They had a method to avoid this. To avoid this, if the dugout was to not be in use for an extended period, it would be submerged in the water or buried in wet sand. Another thing that Mr. Wagner had pointed out to me, that with care, these late woodlanders had a vehicle that once completed might last them 20, 30 years. In comparison to the investment and time we put into a vehicle today for a couple years, we don't get a good deal compared to them. Stopping here about the canoes and dugouts gives an incomplete picture, though. In another installment, we will look at the waterways and trails that made up the ancient transportation system of the Native American people. And here's a little teaser. We will in the future video take a look at a stone from Oscoda's Ovanetton Creek, which may be one of Michigan's earliest surviving maps. As we have seen already, the late woodland carpenter was busy indeed. His job began with making his own tools. There had to be wooden and sometimes bone handles for the cutting devices to be set into. In looking at a superb collection of wooden reproductions Jerry Wagner had recreated just as the originals were made, I had access of peeking back at a toolkit of the late woodland carpenter. Just as they would have done, Mr. Wagner sought out just the right branch formation in which to set the adze and the axe. The same was true of the draw knife, with its razor-sharp flint blade set into the section of branch. Hammer stones and axes were hafted onto wooden handles. Nearly every manual woodworking tool we have today, they had, including flint drills expertly knapped in the same technique that was used to produce the arrowheads. Hunting would have been near impossible without the carpenter, as he made the arrow and the spear shafts, as well as the bow. He knew how to heat the shafts and bend them just right so that they would be straight. And of course, the carpenter needed to know just the right wood types to make the bow from which the arrow would be fired with deadly precision. Choice of materials and the design of the arrows was not random. Humidity affects wooden bows. The Indians used a variety of materials to make the bow stave. One of the most important requirements was the wood being flexible without breaking. Ash, hickory, cedar, walnut, and birch were all good choices and were readily available to the late woodland Indians of Michigan. The arrow shafts were made from shoots such as dogwood, ash, birch, and such. The string, of course, would have been of sinew and possibly woven plant fiber. Woodworking was an essential in many aspects of late woodland life. We have already discussed in Part 2 that bowls and pots were made from clay, and bark containers were common also. But again, from early contact period documents, we know carved wooden bowls were also widely used. These were bowls that would have been much larger than those made of clay, and because of the size and use would have had to been much more durable. They were expertly carved. Other items that were employed wood included totem symbols and drums, which were very much a part of the American Indian way of life. I'd like to now go to the article that appeared in Popular Woodworking magazine in September of 1990, and again that was titled Working Wood in the Age of Stone. When we consider the prehistoric peoples of the Americas, we naturally tend to think of the beautiful stone artifacts on display in museums and private collections. And why not? After all, this period before writing is generally known as the Stone Age. Nonetheless, when the Europeans first made contact with the Indians, they found that wooden implements were as abundant as stone ones. We have few prehistoric wood relics today, of course, because untreated wood does not stand up well to the ravages of time. A few examples of Native American woodworking have survived, one not far from where I live. From out of the muck along Cedar Lake, near Oscoda, Michigan, was pulled a dugout canoe, but such relics are few and far between. Many of the stone tools recovered by archaeologists are directly related to woodworking. Let's take a look at these stone woodworking tools and some of the woodworking duties that occupied the American Indians. The basic tool was the axe or celt, the difference being that the axe is grooved in order to attach to the handle, while the celt is not. Axes are grooved in several ways. In some, the groove runs all the way around the stone, while others show a three-quarter groove or half groove. Celts are easier to make and more abundant than grooved axe. But the manufacture of any stone tool is complicated and a difficult endeavor, requiring skill developed through considerable practice. Most axes are single-bitted, although double-bitted ones have been found, and some are fluted and barbed. Prehistoric peoples also made ceremonial axes, which were quite often elaborate and intended for burial inclusion. Felling a tree with a stone axe or celt was a laborious undertaking. The most common method was to build a fire around the base of the tree and burn into it as far as possible. Then an axe was used to chop away the carbonized wood. The process was repeated over and over until the tree was downed. When planks were required, stone or wood wedges were used to split what was needed off the trunk. Another important tool in the Indian woodworking was the stone drill, generally made of chert and either straight or T-shaped, and they were set into wooden shafts and spun by hand or by the use of a bow. The adze, usually hefted in wood from the crotch of a tree, was essentially, in many Native American tribes, Native American tribes. It was especially useful in carving dugout canoes. The method was similar to felling the tree. The maker burned into the log and carved away the charred wood. Native Americans made many fine small items of wood. Wooden spoons were common, as were bowls, face masks, and in some areas totem poles. While the rough forms could be worked out with the axe or adze, something akin to a knife was needed to fine-tune them. The waste slivers from the chipping of flint and flaking of arrowhead production provided a rich source of carving and whittling blades. If you've ever excavated at an archaeological site where chert had been worked, you probably sliced your hands more than once on the razor-sharp debitage. The pieces flake off in all sizes and are ideal for wood carving. An important use for wood was in the making of arrow shafts. The photo above right shows a notch tool used to smooth shafts. The Indians also made and used stone wrenches for straightening shafts, and sometimes these tools were worn as personal ornamentation. Some tribes fashioned war clubs, fish hooks, bows, baby carrying boards, and even pipe stems from wood. Another important use of wood in the Stone Age was structural. The small tree felled and employed as poles in the great variety of Native American homes. Basket making was very much a woodworking art. John and Sue Naganigan, Native Americans who make baskets in the old way, began by felling the black ash tree by cutting it into measurable lengths. The wood is then beat with a hammer, stone in the ancient times, until the annual growth rings can be separated and cut into strips. After they have dried, the strips are split into thinner strips, which are then woven into sturdy baskets. We've just scratched the surface of an immense subject, and the purpose of this video is not to be all comprehensive, but just to give a basic idea as to what life was like in a late woodland Native American Indian village in Michigan. Life in a Native American Late Woodland Indian Village in Michigan, Part 4 by Dennis M. Morrison. So far, we've looked at a number of things. We've looked at carpentry and pottery making traditions and how the late woodlanders dressed, and various things about them. There is so much to cover, though. One of the things that has fascinated me for a long time is medicine of the late woodland Indians here in Michigan. I had an article published probably about 12 years ago now. It was in Herb Companion magazine called "Ancient Herbs Survive at Potshard Bog," and it was an article about the old Annetton Creek site in Oscoda, Michigan, and a little boggy area there where there were an incredible amount of medicinal plants. And I know that these were present in the late woodland times too, and that the Native Americans availed themselves to the properties of these plants. By the way, I will put a link in the description to a video that I did a while back based on that article, again by the same title, Ancient Herbs Survive at Potshard Bog. But I want to talk this time about the medical practices of the late woodlanders and the Michigan Native Americans in general. And to do that, I'm going to read some parts from Hindale's Primitive Man in Michigan, and I'll probably interrupt once in a while and interject some things that I know firsthand. But Mr. Hinsdale wrote, "The idea that diseases can be alleviated by treatment is a very old one. Certainly its origins goes down to a much lower stratum of culture than the American Indians level. Medicine is a difficult term to define. The definitions of modern physicians set forth different conceptions from those the primitive people had of its scope. Medicine and religion were so mingled in the primitive mind that it was a long time before the fundamentals of each became separable." Now I might interject here. If you'd like to learn more about the religious and medicine practices and their combination in the Great Lakes region, I'd suggest you try to get a copy of my book, Secret Society of the Shamans, that was published in the mid-1990s by Global Communications. Once in a while it comes available on eBay, and frequently it can be gotten on Amazon. But to continue with Mr. Hinsdale, he continues, this continent affords a good example of the intimate relation between medicine and religion, and the combination having developed to such an extent that most of the religious rites often very elaborate and prolonged, have as their main purpose the treatment of sickness. Prayer, songs, ecstatic adoration, supplication, magic, soothsaying, laying on of hands, fasting, feasting, massage baths, sweats, physics, narcotics, fermented drinks, bloodletting, cupping, counter-irritants, poultices, salves, draughts, signs and suggestions, signatures, taboos, tonics, and blisters were all part of the Indians' practices. Homeopathy with its similars, allopathy with its opposites, osteopathy with its manipulations, Christian Science with its sittings, spiritualism with its seances are systems in their fundamentals thousands of years older than is comprehended by most of those who practice them. Signs had to be right. Rituals had to be performed. Extra-human powers of both high and low degree had to be invoked, compensated, and propitiated. Particular spirits had to be called forth, and malign ones had to be driven away. Sometimes the patient, sometimes the doctor, sometimes other person or thing had to take the medicine or receive the treatment. One cannot describe the functions of doctors and priests separately in those times. They were usually one and the same performer, employing both the ritual of religion and the practice of the medicine man inseparably combined. There was no distinction between the two in the conception of the prehistoric invalid. Cannibalism may have had its origins in medicine, springing from the desire of the consumer to acquire the power, valor, and virtues of the consumed. And I had to pause for just a moment to let my best little friend Charlie, my black Burmese cat, into the room with me because he was scratching at the door. He loves to be in this room when I put together the audio for these videos, and I think you can hear him in the background now. He is my medicine, the best little friend I've ever had. But I'm sorry to digress. Let's continue. Cannibalism may have had its origin in medicine springing from the desire of the consumer to acquire the power, the prowess, valor, and virtues of the individual being consumed. In the conception of the savage, to partake of his body was the best way of partaking of the spirit of another person. Later, this conception took on a more refined form and very vicarious substitute was used. And I'll interject here too that there is notation in early contact documents that cannibalism was indeed practiced in the Great Lakes, but I have found nothing to indicate that it was practiced with any, well, it was very limited in scope, is what I'm trying to say. To continue, though, on the theory that a part strengthens a part, different organs and other parts of animals, such as hearts, intestines, glands, brains, feet, and hands, were eaten as medicine. Whatever appeared to benefit or work to advantage, whether in curing or preventing disease, or bringing good luck of any kind, was indeed good medicine. The Indians had a wonderful pharmacy of plants and of something to take in case of sickness. Edward Eggleston, in The Transit of Civilization, says that 300 species of plants had been collected and were used as remedies by the Indians. Nothing about the Indians' methods and habits so much impressed the early settlers as their doctoring. Charlatans and Indian doctors using hocus pocus and swamp roots claimed to have been obtained from Indian mysteries have thriven down through present times. And keep in mind this was written in the 1930s, and a lot of medications, especially patent medicines, used Indian names and supposedly Indian formulas. But anyways, it is a fact that from the botany of the New World, several of our most valuable medications have been obtained through the medium of Indians. Indians also had a rough and ready surgery and useful arts in the experience or the emergencies of forest life, as accidents frequently happened, I'm sure. Perhaps antidotes for snake bites and poisons have been exploited as much as any of the Indians' supposed specifics. Probably amulets, fetishes, gorgets, and a very large number of the so-called ceremonial and problematical relics were a part of the medicine man's armada. I want to add here too, when Hinsdale talks about problematical relics, there's not a time, I don't think, that I haven't gone out onto a site and worked that I haven't found artifacts, obviously worked by the hand of man, that we have absolutely no concept of what they were used for. And so it is not beyond the realm of possibility that these problematical artifacts did indeed have something to do with the medicinal practices, of the culture. So the medicinal value, Hinsdale continues, of Peruvian bark, of which quinine is an alkaloid, was learned from the natives of South America by Jesuit missionaries. Ipecac, at one time so much used in medical practice, was also used by the natives of tropical South America. Cocoa, which yields cocaine, was a divine plant of the Incas. Tobacco was great medicine to the people here in the Great Lakes. Tobacco was used as medicine not only for the body, but for the spirit, for the mind. It drew the user closer to Gitche Manitou, the Great Spirit, because as the smoke ascended from your body, they believed it took the prayer up to God, Gitche Manitou. Sarsaparilla is also from tropical America. Boneset, golden seal, snake root, ginseng, lady slipper, ivy, wild cherry, prickly ash, jimson weed are among the plants common in Michigan that are claimed to have medicinal properties, and not only claimed to have medicinal properties, but indeed do have, and the Indians have known this for at least several thousand years. There was among the Chippewa and neighboring tribes a secret medicine society or lodge, the Midiwewan, that had 4 degrees, Hinsdale wrote. This ancient order had great influence as one advanced through the degrees. His ability to cure disease and his spiritual insight and powers progressively increased. Again, to learn more about the Midiwewan, check out my book, Secret Society of the Shamans, which has a lot in it. I don't have a copy any longer. I gave the last one to my little girl, who's now in her 20s and married and in Florida. So I'm going to have to try to obtain a copy for myself through Amazon. And when I do, I will make some videos based on those chapters about the Medieval one, so that you can I can share that with you. Now, one practice that the Indians of the Great Lakes, particularly up around the Devil's River area, Devil's Lake, Devil's River, that fascinates me, and I don't know if I say this right, but it's trepanning, where the skull is open. And this fascinates me particularly because my stepson David, who we live together, has hydrocephalus, and in the probably, I'm trying to think how long I've known David now, but it's been, well, probably about 13 or 14 years. He's had over 25 brain surgeries where they've opened his skull and placed shunts to drain the excess fluid. And the thing is, I've been able to see a lot of the procedures that they've done with him, and the conditions have to be sterile because of the contaminants that can get in and wreak havoc. And yet the ancient people who lived up by Alpena and Arsenic opened the skulls of patients, I would have to assume, and they did it without having to worry about the sterile surgical rooms and that. So Hinsdale wrote a little bit about this too, and I would like to share that with you, and he titles it Perforation of Skulls. And it's really a fascinating chapter. Years ago, he wrote, a very important mound discovery was made, as narrated by Mr. Henry Gilman, in what is now called the Great Mound of the Rouge River near Detroit. A number of human skulls that were taken from the mound had been artificially perforated. The apertures varied from less than a half inch to nearly an inch across. They were round with somewhat flaring edges, some giving evidence of having been bored with a stone point or flint drill. Similar specimens were found elsewhere in the eastern part of the state in the Lake Huron drainage. Mr. Gilman states that the perforations were made after death. There is in the University Museum a specimen of real trepanning from near Devil's River Mound, which is near Alpena and Arsenic. A very symmetrical hole was bored in the top of the skull while the person was still alive. The edges of the opening show unmistakable evidence of a well-advanced healing process which could have only gone on during life. Trepaned skulls have been found in places far distant from here, being very numerous in Peru and in Mexico. From nowhere, however, in the Great Lakes region have many, if any, been reported except from Michigan. So all the states and Canada surrounding the Great Lakes have virtually no record of this ever having been performed, but yet up there by Alpena and Arsenic, which is a very unusual area anyways archaeologically, the natives practiced this. For another really this non-medical thing that took place up there, see my video called the Nabcazoan Discs of Alpena, Michigan. I'll put a link to that also in the description up above, because it was the only place in the entire Great Lakes area that these kind of discs were found. So anyways, I'm sorry I got off on that. Check that out though if you get a chance. Anyways, where we left off. From nowhere, however, in the Great Lakes region have many, if any, been reported except from Michigan. One might ask why the skulls were perforated. In the majority of specimens, the operation was probably performed after or immediately preceding death. Mr. Hardlicka suggests that the skulls bored after death were so treated for the purpose of securing the button as a fetish. Some of the heads might have been operated upon with a view of removing pieces of weapons for restoring the shape of the head after a severe thump. The skull in the museum to which reference has been made shows no evidence of either injury or disease having been present. In directly the center of the vertex are the unusual perforations. The operation may have been performed for some medical religious reason, to let the bad spirit out or a good spirit in. But either of which, of course, is wild conjecture. The fact remains that perfectly normal skulls were trepaned while the subject was still alive. Professor Roy S. Moody asserts with great assurance that ancient trepanning was for the relief of headache. And I might add, this is what I believe the case was. It is surprising to note that in the Handbook of American Indians under Medicine and Medicine Men, the statement trepanning has never been found north of Mexico. We may safely say that trepanning, though not extensively practiced, was a distinctive trait of Michigan culture. Of itself, it constitutes a topic well worthy of intensive study. Where did it come from? How did the Native Americans up on Thunder Bay, Devil's River, Devil's Lake, in Alpena and Ossining come upon this knowledge so isolated that they could possibly relieve headaches by opening the skull? And I'll add one even more, because I don't believe just typical headaches they would do this for. I believe, after my experience with my stepson David, that the Indians, the Native Americans there, opened the skull because they knew it would relieve the internal pressure of too much fluid in the skull and in the spinal column, which is what hydrocephalus is. And left in and of itself, it causes the skull to expand and can actually crack the skull because the pressure becomes tremendous and the pain becomes unbearable. They would probably have noted the change in the size of the skull, the change in the behavior of the person, the seizures the person was having, and some very smart individual had thought to open the skull and relieved the pressure that was there. But at any rate, it is common to find pieces of pottery with holes broken through the bottom, Hinsdale writes. While the pots were not damaged in any other way, they were purposely punctured, probably at some time or the same time of being placed in graves. Such specimens are said to have been killed. That is, they were broken through so as to release the spirits that they contained, because the Indians, let's not forget, believed that everything inanimate also had a spirit. He continued, besides killing pottery, the custom was in some districts to kill weapons, pipes, and other entombed articles. This may account for finding so many broken specimens in graves and in mounds. The killing set free the spirits of the object so they could readily take flight with the spirit of the dead person. Is it not possible, he wrote, that the same animistic conception that led to the killing of pottery, weapons, etc., was also a reason for perforating human skulls? He asks. The killing would, according to an Indian's conception, enable a quicker release of the spirit. Now that might be possible in some cases, and I can even see that in some instances that a piece was taken out of the skull in this method and used as a fetish, to maybe secure the special hunting abilities or warring abilities or something that the individual had. But that can't be said of the skull from the Ossining Alpena area, because it was healing when the person died and had been healing for a considerable period of time. The Native American Indians of Michigan, whether it's the Archaic period or the Woodland periods, are nothing less than fascinating. They had an incredible environment to live in, and they had an incredible culture. And it would be so amazing to see what that culture would have become had the Europeans not come into Michigan and ruined the neighborhood, so to speak. Well, anyways, thanks for taking a listen. If you have comments on the additions to what I put here about the medicines of the Native American Indians in the Late Woodland in Michigan, or any other period, please feel free to leave your comments. I always am delighted to have them, whether they agree with me or mock me or support me. I'm happy to hear from you in any regard. So until next time, when I do part 5 of this series, thanks for taking a listen. And to Jordan Jackie and Noah, hey, you guys are awesome. God bless you. Bye-bye. Life in a Late Woodland Native American Indian Village in Michigan, Part 5. In this series, I've used W.B. Hinsdale's book, Primitive Man in Michigan, quite a bit because, well, it was published in the 1930s, and a lot of it is dated material, definitely, but there's a lot of good basic material in there, too. And I'm going to use him again in this video, and I'm going to, as I did in the last one, I'll stop and give comments along the way based on my own experience in the field over the last 30 years. I'm not an expert, a professional archaeologist by any means, but I have learned a great deal from actually being out there in the field and working to discover the ancient prehistoric past of Northeast Michigan in particular. In what I want to discuss with you today in this chapter are workshops. And we looked some at occupations of the Late Woodland Native American Indians, but I want to look particularly at the workshops where the flint was knapped and formed into tools. And as we already discussed, in Indian culture, prehistoric Indian culture, late woodland being no different, that the roles that the men and the women played were quite segregated, if you will. Each had their own specific roles in society, worked well that way, and the male role primarily was hunting and gathering and fishing and the production of tools, defending the village and the family. Well, the workshop, then, was a very important place for the male member of the Late Woodland Village. And I'm going to start here with what W.B. Hinsdale had to say, and then I'll go off on my own little tirade in a minute. A workshop is easily recognized. It is a place where flinty spalls, flakes, rejects, and broken stone implements are found in great abundance within a small space. Chippers, hand hammers, and anvils are generally interspersed among the debris. More than likely, at such a place, some ancient arrow maker did his work. Often, the crude material upon which he operated was brought from a distant place. Again, in localities where the material existed naturally in the rock or soil, chipping was done close by. Blanks were frequently roughed out into leaf-shaped pieces at the source of the supply, and then taken home to be retouched into the desired finished shapes. Caches or hoards of such blanks are not infrequent and are described in another paragraph. Arrow and spearheads that appear to be made of imported material are common on Michigan sites. Ohio flint is well distributed throughout the state. Obsidian, which is volcanic glass, does not exist in the natural state this side of the Rocky Mountains. But it found its way here and beyond. Native flinty stone suitable for chipping is abundant in places, but most of it is not of a real fine quality. And I guess I would stop there and say a couple things. There is a lot of flint in Michigan, our chert, and there is a lot of Bayport nodular chert and Bayport tabular chert. And while it is true that some of it is not of a superior high quality, some of it is of a very fine quality. Yes, it doesn't have the spectacular colors that some of the cherts from various parts of the country have. It nonetheless produced very fine arrowheads and spear points and knives. So anyways, let's continue with what Mr. Hinsdale was explaining to us. Occasionally, a choice piece of float material was found and made into some desired object. Without doubt, a large number of ready-made implements were imported. We cannot decide always whether those of non-native stuff were brought in as found or were brought in the rough. Here is opportunity for fine distinction. If a piece is of a kind of workmanship not usual in the district, it is probably a foreign product. If the design is common and the tooling not unusual, it may have been made from blanks or the natural stones that were transported from faraway places. The cherts and flints of the state are generally drab of color, and this is true. They are rather coarse-grained. This is not true. and often contain fossils, blemishes, and flaws, which is true. Although a few beautifully banded or striated shirts with a play of colors are to be found. Along the Cucullin River in Bay County, there were numbers of workshops where whole nodules, fragments in all stages of reduction, and finished specimens were abundant. The natural nodules found upon the Cucullin workshops and those of the Saginaw were probably transported from the shores of Saginaw Bay and from as far east as the headwaters of the Cass. Near Base Lake in Washtenaw County, workshops present two types of material for chipping. Upon one of them, the spalls and rejects are of excellent quality flint. Not 50 rods away from that shop was another where both the material and workmanship were of very crude character. Interrupt again. That should not really be a surprise, at least with the distinction between quality pieces and crude pieces being made within a short distance of each other. I mean, like maybe a stone's throw, because each person was distinct and individual and had their own talents. I have found some incredibly beautiful worked stone knives and arrowheads, and then some that were really just, excuse me, crappy. But they did the purpose. They suited the purpose. But anyways, continue. The shops were probably the places where two operators, each using a different kind of material from the other, and one more skillful than the other, worked at different times. The place where the cruder work was done, one might conjecture, was the older, especially if the corroborative testimony of other differences could be discovered. And that could be true, but not necessarily so. Fine-grained, gritty gray stone, similar to felsite, but softer, was in general used for implements, and some elegantly wrought spears of it are in collections. Now, this goes to show that a skillful flaker did not always exert his best efforts upon only choice materials. Stones from which axes and celts were made are very abundant along the banks and streams and lakes, and hard water-worn pieces of igneous rock suitable for making axes are plentiful over the surface of the ground. An axe has been made as an experiment in 45 minutes, and a grooved polished specimen of such material as granite in 1.5 hours by a white man employing only the stone tools and methods of the Indian axe maker. Mr. Charles E. Brown says, in changing his place of residence from one campsite to another, it was probably often more convenient for the Indian to leave his axe and other heavier stone implements behind and to make others when he arrived at his destination than to carry them with him. On the other hand, stone axes of a good quality appear to have been often cherished items by their owners. I kind of wonder sometimes about that when I'd find a piece that was, really beautiful or spectacular. And I found a celt, which is an ungrooved axe, and it was absolutely beautiful. There was not a flaw, and perfect design, sharp bit edge, and it was halfway down a bank at Old Vanetton Creek, and it was buried probably about 12 inches down. And I always wondered, why? Because did he just lose it, or did he leave it? Was it easier for him to come back to it later? Such might be the case. At Old Vanetton Creek in Oscoda, and also the Goodwin Gresham site in Oscoda, we see two different occupations during the late woodland occupation period. And this is where I feel that I have a better idea of what was going on in the Oscoda area at these particular sites than the professional comes in, because the professional archaeologists, who do a wonderful job with what they do, but they use a technique called site sampling. When they came into the Goodwin Gresham site years ago, which was just a stone's throw from Old Vanetton Creek, site sampling showed it to be a middle woodland, sparsely occupied camp. And they based this on 2 or 3 small site samplings. Actually, Goodwin Gresham was a huge site, really, where stone tools were produced. It was a male work site. Thousands and thousands of flakes and thousands of arrowheads and things have come off from that site over the years. All male-produced items. Whereas if you go over to Old Vanetton Creek, which again is maybe a couple blocks away by our measurement of things. This is a village site, and it was the woman's site where the woman took care of things. And there, my ex-wife and I and my son Dennis and my daughter Charlene found the remains of over 1,500 pottery vessels based on the rim shards alone, most of which are hopefully still in the collection of the Oscoda Sable Historical Society. Site sampling does not work. There would never be a record of the extensive late woodland occupation at Goodwin Gresham if we were just to take the word of the professionals that had gone in there. So one other thing sticks in my mind that I want to tell you about workshops, because this was really interesting, and this took place at Goodwin Gresham as I was doing, my goodness, probably about 25 years ago now. I was very carefully excavating a small site which had hundreds and hundreds of sharp flint flakes in there that I actually, lacerated my hands on. But as I cleared it gently away, you could actually see the outline of a person that had been sitting there. You could see the outline of the backside and the legs, where the legs crossed and everything, because the chips didn't fall there. Let the chips fall where they may. But anyways, that's about it for this chapter, or this installment, and hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be back with another one soon. Life in a Late Woodland Indian Village in Michigan, Part 6, Education of the Young, by Dennis M. Morrison. In preparing this series, one thing I really wanted to show is that basically the Late Woodland Indians were not much different than we are today. In fact, as I walk the streets of Saginaw where I live, I would say that the people that lived here 1,400 years ago were our superiors in many, many very basic ways. In Part 6, I want to take a look at education. How did the Late Woodland people teach their children? I remember in working at Old Vanetton Creek site in Oscoda that I came across numerous artifacts that were clearly instructional in nature, but more on those a bit later. Of course, the Late Woodland people did not have books, nor as far as is known did they have any form of writing. The minds of the adults served as living textbooks to pass on vital knowledge to the next generation. The storyteller, for example, served as a history teacher, so to speak. I'm only guessing, but I would imagine most villages had a storyteller whose job it was to orally communicate great historic tales and ingrain in the minds of the youth tales of their heritage. In his book, First People of Michigan, W.B. Hinsdale wrote the following: Folkways, among all grades of culture, are largely taught by unconscious suggestion. A young girl of ordinary intelligence does not need to be taught how to use a broom, or a boy how to drive a stake in the ground. All children learn by casual observation, and attain proficiency by imitation. In a culture which is without an alphabet or other means for perpetuating tribal history or keeping records, the memory becomes greatly developed and achieves a marvelous degree of accuracy. Hinsdale continued, the Indians had traditions, stories, rituals, accounts of previous events to which they attached the greatest importance as part of their social life. A man who knows how to write, Hinsdale points out, can jot down important items and forget them depending upon his memoranda for refreshing his memory. But the man who cannot write has no such device. The tablets of his mind are his daybook, ledger, and historical record, end quote. In times past, when I would think of the Indian, I never thought about how one became a chief or a medicine man. I go to Hinsdale often, and here I'm going to again. He had some interesting thoughts and insights. On this he wrote, "The Indian boy, if he aspired to be a chief, a medicine man, a great warrior, a skillful hunter, or in some way to exercise an influence in his village, had to undergo as rigid a training as any nevotate for the priesthood. If one could have asked an Indian how he acted in certain cases as he did, he would have answered that his ancestors did so. The nearer one approaches to what we call the primitive forms of society, the more he will observe the customs, traditions, and conformity are less elastic and culture less dynamic. It is easy," end quote, by the way, "it is easy to assume that the villagers at my old Vanetton Creek site took great pride in their ancestors as they carried out to pretty exacting standards customs of making arrowheads, stone pecking, canoe making, pottery making, and so on. The Indian not only had to learn what to do and when to do it, but there were many things that he must not do or do at a certain time and under very strict attention to rules. In late woodland life, the people had many superstitious beliefs. Every important event was according to ritual, not a published list of regulations. No, rather rigid codes of social customs which evolved over generations. An early teen male Native American of the woodlands knew more vital facts, life skills, and survival skills than any modern boy could. Tossed out on their own, they would survive because of their education. When the power grid which makes our life possible today fails, and at some point it likely will, how many adults or our young people will have the education to survive? Are we highly advanced because of our computers and other electronics? Certainly not. If all that failed, we would become truly savage and survive by plundering, stealing, and yes, even killing. We, for the most part, have no connection to survival skills that our ancestors had, as the Native American had, and was the basis of their education. If I were to outline the late woodland educational basics for hunting alone, just for hunting, it would look much like this. Number 1, general rules applying to all kinds of hunting. 2, the making of arrows and spears and other lithics. 3, how to use particular implements for a specific purpose. 4, preparation for the hunt. 5, knowledge about traps and trapping. 6, how to go through woods without making sounds. 7, how to hunt in the day and at night. Keep in mind this is just considering the subject of hunting. Things would then get more specific. For example, how to track deer, time of the year to hunt deer, time of the day when success would be best, how to approach deer without scaring them, using the arrows, skinning, prepping for cook, prepping for preserving, tanning the skins, and many other topics, and this would just be for the one occupation of hunting, and then specifically for hunting the deer. In each of these, remember, an adult was the living textbook. An adult taught how to make pottery, to cook, to do agriculture, to fish, and literally hundreds of other subjects the Native American of the late woodland or any other era needed to know. These were essential to survival. That the children learned by following what an elder taught them could clearly be seen at the old Vanetton Creek site in both the making of pottery and the production of arrowheads. I personally found, based on rim shards, the remains of over 1,500 pottery vessels at Old Vanetton Creek. Among them, the majority were very nicely crafted and well made by a lady with much experience and skill. In many cases, right alongside were pots of a very inferior quality, crude decorative techniques, inconsistent thickness. These bespoke of a young person's early attempts in learning the necessary art of pottery construction. I remember one little pot which was no bigger around than a quarter and less than a half an inch tall, very crude, with a stick poked in the center to form the depression. This was without question a first or early attempt at a young girl to learn pottery. The educational process for this alone would have had to be most complex and of vital importance to the sedentary lifestyle of the late woodland people, for pottery containers made it possible to store foods during time of abundance so the community did not have to be constantly on the move looking for daily food sources. Likewise with arrow point production, arrows are primarily made of chert, a very, very hard stone, and only once did I see a deviation from this at Old Venetton Creek, and I believe that was a point made by a student, so to speak. I was digging and finding the fragments of a very soft shale or slate. It was black in color and about 5 inches down in the ground, near the railroad tracks. I found one quite remarkable arrowhead made of this material, and it did not resemble any known form. It was obviously a practice piece. It measured about a half an inch long and was about as thick as maybe 2 pieces of typing paper. It was notched, but the base flared and was lopsided. It could have never served a functional purpose and was quite so obviously a practice piece. Fired from a bow, it would have shattered and done absolutely no damage to what was being aimed at. These two illustrations, one with pottery and the other with the arrowhead, shows some basics about education at Old Venetton Creek and other late woodland sites. I already spoke briefly about the storyteller of the village and his role as a sort of living history book. I again go back to Hinsdale, who had some interesting concepts on the life stories and their part in training the late woodland children. Hinsdale wrote, and I quote, "Storytelling was a useful means of education. Around the campfire, in the lodges, upon special occasions, at ceremonial festivals, by myth, fable, fiction, allegory, and the narration of actual exploits, the children absorbed lore and history of their ancestors, both immediate and remote. If these narrations, which upon occasion amounted to real orations, had been reduced to writing, they would deserve to be called literature." At the grade of culture our Michigan Indians had attained, the family was an important educational institution. Hinsdale continued, "The young Indian finally came to a time when he took his graduate course for which, from his infancy, the lectures and stories of the lodge and campfire together with practical instructions that he had received prepared him for. Spirituality and instruction in it was begun nearly at infancy." By the way, that was an end quote. "It was a vital part of their existence. In their very early teen years, they were taught life would have they would have a special dream, today referred to as a vision quest. In this dream, he would become aware of who would be his personal Manitou or guardian and spiritual guide and educator through his entire life. To attain this dream took special instruction, and the youth, fast in isolation, would have his special vision. Religious instruction used to have high importance in our society, and its downfall has led in part to the moral decay which infects our society from youth to adult. In late woodland life, religious spiritual instruction was vital, and its role cannot be overstated. But in concluding this presentation, though, I must one more time turn to Mr. Hinsdale, who summed things up as follows. One may consider for a moment what the untutored Native American taught the people who came to take his place in the files of time. He pointed out the paths through the trackless wilderness and how to get through without the use of a compass. He showed the places where food animals could be captured and how to trail them, where the sturgeon could be pulled out of the waters, and other fish be able to be taken by net, spear, and hook. He led to the haunts of fur-bearing animals and gave lessons in canoe building and the making of snowshoes. The white man took over the entire routine of the corn culture from the Indians and learned from them how to make sugar from the sap of maple trees. The Indian located the places where copper could be mined in an almost pure state. Words have been added to our language from the speech of the Indians." End quote. Education, though carried out differently, was as vital to the late woodland Indian as a college degree is to a young person today, and I would dare say it was even more important because his very survival depended on it, not only his, but his family and his village. I want to tell you of another artifact I found at Old Venetton Creek in Oscoda. I believe it carried a lot of significance in education of one particular area, though I'm sure what I'm going to say would be ridiculed by professional archaeologists because it, was not discovered by one of their own. and thus it has no basis in reality, so to speak. By the way, before I tell you about this artifact, which I believe to be one of Michigan's very earliest maps, let me tell you a little about what has become of it. This artifact ended up in the collections of the Ascota Asable Historical Society. They, years ago, obtained my collection from me during a really nasty divorce, and I also gave them, or provided them with all of my field notes and everything. With no notation of its significance, it was in a collection of other artifacts displayed there labeled Finds by Area Residents. I had spent literally hundreds of hours alone at Old Vanetton Creek and had provided the society with copies of all my field notes. But rather than having me put the pertinent information with some very significant artifacts, they just lumped them all together. They were found by area residents. Big whoopee frickin' deal. If you don't have the story behind them and you don't know what they are, how can you properly display them, and how can you, it's very frustrating because that one artifact is so highly significant and no notation at all when I saw it last, which was a couple years ago, as to what it was. If you have a significant collection, truly the information preserved, you would want the information preserved. I would never let it go ever again. A collection to a local historical society where a few people pretend to know what historic preservation is all about. All useful information I could have provided them with has never been sought or desired, and in the past I have been in contact with them. Every personal detail that I could give about every artifact I took from the ground, there seems to be no interest in. Anyways, having said that, the artifact in question is a lightweight tan stone about the size of an average adult hand. It has a hole in one end that goes all the way through, and it also has on it some very light line etching. It again is from the Late Woodland at Old Vanetton Creek. When I originally found this, I totally missed the true importance of it, believing it to be nothing more than a gorget with some prehistoric doodling on it. I believe now, I know, it was much, much more than that. To me, without question, it is a map of Vanetton Lake. The drilled area of the pendant represents the north end of Vanetton Lake and the island there. The lines around it, I believe, clearly shows the major trails around the lake, particularly at the south end where Vanetton Creek enters the lake. A very rare piece and an educational piece to the people who were using it. This would be a truly rare example of an educational piece from Ascota, Michigan some 1,400 years ago. It would have been highly significant to the person who crafted it, for it preserved knowledge for himself and others to use. Its significance is lost, though, because of being in the collection of a local historical society has no interest in this rare and significant piece, which was, when I last saw it, as I said, about I think it was about 6 years ago actually, was just randomly lumped in with a few other artifacts displayed, found by area residents. And it pisses me off. Because yes, a lot of area residents make a few little finds here and there, don't care about the knowledge that can be preserved, and just pick it up and give it to the Historical Society. Fine, hunky-dunky. That makes a nice display. But where the value is in not just in the artifact, but is in the information preserved. And just like those living history books, the storytellers of the tribes, the history of every artifact there that I took out of the ground, which numbers in thousands, is in my mind. Anyways, I'm sorry about that tangent. Hope you enjoyed this a little bit about the education in Late Woodland Society, and I will bring you another video on life in a Late Woodland village in Michigan very soon. Thanks for taking a listen, and I hope I didn't offend too many people.